The mansion stands empty now, hidden behind overgrown hemlock trees and rusted iron gates somewhere in the Hudson Valley. Most maps don't show it. Local real estate agents won't discuss it. The few historians who know its location speak about it carefully, measuring their words. The building itself, what remains of it, presents a facade of weathered limestone and broken windows. Ivy climbs the eastern wall, covering what were once intricate carvings. The roof has collapsed in the western wing. Rain enters freely, staining the interior walls with dark streaks that locals say look like bloodstains, though they're just water damage. Probably. This is not a mansion that appears in coffee table books about American architecture. You won't find it featured in documentaries about Gilded Age excess. The historical societies that preserve estates along the Hudson River don't include it on their tours. This absence is intentional, deliberate, the result of decades of careful effort to remove this building from public consciousness and historical record. The mansion has a name, though using it invites complications. For now, understand that it was built in 1895 by one of America's wealthiest families, occupied for less than 20 years, and then systematically erased from history by the Rockefellers. The reasons involve death, scandal, occult practices, and secrets so damaging that one of America's most powerful dynasties spent millions ensuring they stayed buried. This is the story of that mansion, the family that built it, the horrors that occurred within its walls, and the extraordinary lengths the Rockefellers went to erase it from history. The building rose from ambition and wealth, flourished briefly in gilded splendor, then became something else entirely. Something darker. The transformation happened gradually, then all at once. By the time anyone understood what was happening, it was too late. Before the mansion became cursed, before the Rockefellers got involved, before the deaths and the scandals, there was just a wealthy man with an obsession and enough money to make that obsession real. His name was Cornelius Van Der Berg, though history has worked hard to forget him too. Van Der Berg made his fortune in railroads and copper mining during the 1870s and 1880s. He wasn't as wealthy as the Vanderbilts or the Rockefellers, but he was rich enough. Rich enough to build whatever he wanted. Rich enough to indulge interests that more sensible men would have suppressed. Van Der Berg became obsessed with spiritualism in 1889 after his wife Eleanor died during childbirth. The child died too, a son who lived only 4 hours. Van Der Berg, devastated, began attending séances in New York City. He consulted mediums. He read extensively about contacting the dead. What started as grief transformed into something more consuming. By 1892, Van Der Berg was convinced he could build a structure that would serve as a bridge between the living and the dead. A house designed specifically to facilitate communication with the spirit world. The architectural plans he commissioned were unusual from the start. Van Der Berg hired Edmund Whitmore, a respected but unconventional architect who had studied in Paris and Rome. Whitmore's buildings were known for incorporating symbolic elements and unusual spatial relationships. He was fascinated by sacred geometry and ancient architectural principles. Exactly what Van Der Berg wanted. The design Whitmore created featured 67 rooms arranged according to numerological principles Van Der Berg believed held spiritual significance. The number 67 was supposedly meaningful in certain occult traditions, though which traditions remain unclear. The floor plan incorporated pentagonal elements. Certain rooms had no right angles, only walls meeting at unusual degrees. The ballroom featured a domed ceiling painted with zodiacal symbols and planetary alignments specific to the date of Eleanor Van Der Berg's death. The main staircase spiraled counterclockwise, opposite to traditional design. Van Der Berg insisted on this, believing it would confuse evil spirits while allowing benevolent ones free passage. Doors throughout the house were sized irregularly. Some were 7 feet tall, others barely 6 feet, forcing visitors to stoop. The windows in the eastern wing were positioned to capture moonlight during specific lunar phases. The entire structure was oriented not to the cardinal directions, but to alignments Van Der Berg believed magnified spiritual energy. Construction began in 1893 on a 200-acre property Van Der Berg purchased in the Hudson Valley. The location was reportedly chosen through dowsing, with Van Der Berg walking the property with a pendulum until he found what he called the resonant spot. The site sat on elevated ground with views of the Hudson River to the west. The surrounding forest was dense hemlock and oak. The nearest town was 3 miles south. Van Der Berg wanted isolation. He got it. The workforce assembled for construction was substantial. Over 150 workers at peak activity, including stonemasons, carpenters, plasterers, and craftsmen with specialized skills. The limestone came from quarries in Indiana. The interior woodwork used imported mahogany and teak. The stained glass windows were manufactured in Bavaria according to Van Der Berg's specific designs, which incorporated esoteric symbols. The construction took 2 years. Workers reported strange occurrences from the beginning. Tools would go missing and reappear in unlikely locations. The surveying equipment malfunctioned repeatedly. 3 workers suffered serious injuries in accidents that were described as bizarre. A stonemason fell from scaffolding despite being secured with safety ropes that were later found cut, though no one admitted cutting them. A carpenter's hand was crushed by a beam that multiple witnesses said moved on its own. A glazier installing windows in the eastern wing claimed he saw figures in the glass that weren't reflections of anyone present. Most workers dismissed these incidents as accidents and overactive imaginations. Construction sites were dangerous. People saw things when they were tired. The rational explanations were available and comforting. Some workers weren't comforted. Turnover was high. Men would work a few weeks, collect their pay, and leave without explanation. Van Der Berg had to continuously recruit replacement workers, which slowed progress and increased costs. By late 1895, the mansion was complete enough for occupancy. The exterior was finished. The major interior spaces were done. Some rooms remained incomplete, but Van Der Berg was impatient to move in. He had been waiting years to begin his spiritual experiments in the house designed for that purpose. The mansion Van Der Berg moved into in November 1895 was extraordinary by any measure. The exterior presented a Gothic revival style with Romanesque elements. Limestone walls rose 3 stories above a raised basement. Corner towers gave the building a castle-like profile. Elaborate carvings decorated the entrance portico, depicting what appeared to be angels and demons intertwined. The front doors were 12 feet tall, made of oak reinforced with iron, and reportedly weighed over 1,000 pounds each. Inside, the entrance hall soared 30 feet to a coffered ceiling. The floors were marble, imported from Italy, arranged in geometric patterns that created optical illusions when viewed from certain angles. The grand staircase dominated the space, curving upward in that counterclockwise spiral Van Der Berg insisted upon. The banister was carved mahogany, featuring serpents and vines. The library occupied the entire northern wing of the first floor. Floor-to-ceiling bookcases held Van Der Berg's collection of over 8,000 volumes, including rare texts on spiritualism, occultism, ancient religions, and esoteric philosophy. Some of these books were reportedly very old and very valuable. Some were supposedly dangerous. Books whose contents, Van Der Berg believed, contained knowledge that could open doorways between worlds. The ballroom on the second floor was the mansion's most impressive space. 40 feet long and 30 feet wide, with that unusual domed ceiling painted with astronomical and astrological imagery. The dome's interior surface showed the night sky as it appeared on March 14, 1889, the date of Eleanor Van Der Berg's death. Constellations, planets, and the moon were positioned precisely as they'd been that night. The accuracy was obsessive and unnerving. Around the ballroom's perimeter, Whitmore had designed a series of alcoves, each containing a statue. These weren't classical sculptures, but strange figures that seemed to blend human and animal characteristics. Van der Berg commissioned these specifically, working with sculptors he'd found through his occult contacts. The figures were meant to represent spiritual guardians or gatekeepers. They looked more like monsters. The eastern wing contained what Van der Berg called the séance rooms. These were smaller chambers designed for spiritual communication. Heavy curtains could block all light. The walls were painted dark colors, deep reds and blacks. One room had a floor that was actually a shallow pool, kept filled with water. Van der Berg believed water enhanced spiritual conductivity. Another room had walls lined with mirrors, creating infinite reflections. A third room was perfectly circular with a domed ceiling that created strange acoustic properties. A whisper at one side could be heard clearly on the opposite side. The bedrooms occupied much of the second and third floors. Each was decorated richly with imported furniture, Persian rugs, and artwork. Van der Berg's master bedroom suite occupied the southeast corner of the second floor. Large windows provided views of the grounds and the Hudson River in the distance. The room also connected directly to a private séance chamber where Van der Berg could conduct his experiments away from household staff. The servants' quarters were in the attic and portions of the basement. Van der Berg employed a staff of about 20 people: butler, housekeeper, maids, footman, cook, kitchen staff, groundskeepers, and a coachman. Most were local residents who needed the employment. Some came from New York City, recruited specifically because they had experience in grand houses. None of them stayed long. Staff turnover was a constant problem. Servants would work at the mansion for a few weeks or months, then leave suddenly. Sometimes they gave notice. Often they simply disappeared, abandoning their positions without explanation. When asked, former employees were reluctant to discuss their experiences. They would mention strange atmospheres and uncomfortable feelings. Some reported seeing things, shadows that moved independently, sounds with no source, doors that opened and closed on their own. Van der Berg dismissed these concerns. He explained that the house was designed to be spiritually active. The phenomena his servants found disturbing were exactly what he'd intended. The mansion was working as designed, becoming a bridge between worlds. The spirits were responding to his invitations. He began conducting séances regularly, sometimes several per week. He invited mediums and spiritualists to the mansion. Some were well-known figures in spiritualist circles. Others were obscure practitioners whose names appeared in no published records. These séances followed various formats. Some used traditional methods, sitting around tables in darkened rooms, attempting to contact specific spirits. Others employed more unusual techniques. Van der Berg kept detailed journals documenting his spiritual experiments. These journals, leather-bound volumes filled with his handwriting, described the séances, the methods used, the results achieved. He recorded communications he believed came from his dead wife, Eleanor. He documented appearances of other spirits who he claimed visited the mansion. The journals included diagrams of spiritual energy fields he believed he was detecting. He sketched figures he saw during trance states. The journals also revealed Van der Berg's descent into something darker than grief-driven spiritualism. By 1897, just 2 years after moving into the mansion, his writings showed increasing interest in not just communicating with the dead, but commanding them. He studied necromancy. He experimented with rituals drawn from various occult traditions. The séances became more elaborate and more disturbing. Servants who remained long enough reported seeing strange ceremonies in the ballroom late at night, chanting in languages they didn't recognize. Circles drawn on the marble floors in what looked like blood but Van der Berg insisted was red paint. Participants wearing robes and masks. These ceremonies reportedly occurred monthly, timed to moon phases. The few visitors Van der Berg received during this period left concerned. One family friend wrote in a letter preserved in historical archives that Van der Berg seemed consumed by his obsessions to a degree that threatens his sanity and well-being. Another visitor noted that the house itself seems malevolent, as though the architecture has absorbed the dark practices conducted within it. Van Der Berg became reclusive, rarely leaving the property. He stopped attending social functions in New York. Business associates who needed to consult him had to visit the mansion, and most found the experience unsettling enough that they avoided it when possible. Van Der Berg's copper mining and railroad investments continued generating income, but he paid little attention to them. His focus was entirely on his spiritual pursuits. By 1899, Van Der Berg was claiming significant breakthroughs. He told the few people he still communicated with that he had successfully contacted Eleanor, that she visited him regularly, that she had told him things about the afterlife that would revolutionize humanity's understanding of death. He planned to publish his findings, to share his discoveries with the world. He never got the chance. On March 14, 1900, exactly 11 years after Eleanor's death, servants entering Van Der Berg's private séance chamber found him dead. The circumstances were immediately suspicious. Van Der Berg's body was positioned in the center of a circle painted on the floor. Candles surrounded him, all burned down to stubs. His eyes were open, staring upward. His face was frozen in an expression that witnesses described as absolute terror. The initial assumption was heart attack or stroke. Van Der Berg was 53, an age where sudden death wasn't impossible. But the local doctor who examined the body found no clear cause. No signs of heart disease, no evidence of stroke, no wounds or injuries. Van Der Berg appeared to have died of fright, though what could frighten a man to death remained unexplained. The room where he died offered disturbing clues. The circle Van Der Berg had positioned himself in was painted in something dark that everyone assumed was paint, but no one tested. Symbols around the circle's perimeter matched nothing in standard occult references. The mirrors lining the room's walls were all cracked, every single one, though no impact points were visible. Most strangely, the journal Van Der Berg had been keeping was found open to a page with a single sentence written in increasingly erratic handwriting. "They are here and they are not what I thought they were." The authorities investigated briefly. There was no evidence of foul play, no signs anyone else had been in the room. The death was ruled natural causes despite the lack of medical explanation. Van Der Berg's body was buried in the family plot in New York. The investigation closed quickly, perhaps too quickly. Van Der Berg had no close heirs. His parents were dead. He had siblings, but they wanted nothing to do with the mansion or his estate. The property and all contents were to be sold, with proceeds distributed according to his will. This is where the story should have ended. A wealthy eccentric builds a strange house, dies mysteriously, and the property gets sold to someone else. Normal succession of ownership. But no one wanted to buy the Van Der Berg mansion. The property was listed with real estate brokers in New York in the Hudson Valley. The price was reduced multiple times. Still no buyers emerged. The problem wasn't the cost. Wealthy families were building grand estates all along the Hudson during this period. The problem was the house itself and its reputation. Stories about the mansion had spread. Servants who'd worked there talked about their experiences. Visitors who'd attended Van Der Berg's séances shared disturbing accounts. The circumstances of Van Der Berg's death, while officially natural, spawned rumors. The house gained a reputation as cursed, haunted, dangerous. No amount of price reduction could overcome that stigma. The mansion sat empty through 1900 and 1901. Caretakers hired to maintain the property kept quitting. The grounds grew wild. The building began deteriorating. Water damage appeared as gutters clogged and roofing failed. Windows broke. The estate's lawyers struggled to find any solution. Meanwhile, something else was happening. People near the property reported disturbances. Sounds coming from the empty mansion late at night. Lights appearing in windows despite no electricity and no occupants. Figures seen moving on the grounds. Local residents began avoiding the area entirely. The road passing nearest the property saw decreased traffic as people took alternate routes. In 1902, a group of teenagers from a nearby town decided to explore the abandoned mansion. This was foolish but predictable. The house had a reputation as haunted, which made it irresistible to young people seeking thrills. Four boys, all around 16 years old, approached the mansion one October evening. They forced open a ground floor window and climbed inside. What happened during their exploration is documented through their own accounts given to police afterward. The boys reported that the interior was in poor condition but not as deteriorated as expected. Furniture remained in many rooms, covered with dust and cobwebs. Portraits hung on walls. Books still filled the library shelves. It was as though Van Der Berg had died and everyone simply walked away, leaving everything in place. The boys explored the first floor without incident. They found Van Der Berg's library impressive and disturbing. Books lay open on tables as though someone had been reading them recently. One boy reported finding a journal, though whether this was Van Der Berg's final journal or something else was never determined. They climbed the grand spiral staircase to the second floor. The ballroom disturbed them. The painted dome, the strange statues in their alcoves, the whole space felt wrong. The boys reported hearing sounds, faint at first, whispering that seemed to come from multiple directions. They convinced themselves it was wind through broken windows. They continued exploring. One boy, Thomas Hendricks, separated from the group to examine the séance rooms in the eastern wing. His friends heard him scream. They ran toward the sound and found Hendricks standing in the circular room with the strange acoustics. He was staring at something on the floor. When his friends reached him, they saw symbols painted in fresh red material that couldn't be paint because paint would have dried. The symbols were identical to those found around Van Der Berg's body 2 years earlier. The boys fled the mansion. Hendricks was nearly catatonic. His friends had to drag him out of the building and off the property. They took him home, where his parents called a doctor. Hendricks couldn't speak coherently for 3 days. When he finally could talk, he reported seeing figures in the circular room, multiple entities that weren't human. He described them as made of shadow but aware, looking at me with intent. The incident might have been dismissed as adolescent panic and overactive imaginations if not for what happened next. Within a week, all 4 boys who'd entered the mansion became seriously ill. Fevers, delirium, symptoms that resembled severe influenza but didn't respond to treatment. One boy, Michael Cortland, died. The doctor treating him listed cause of death as septicemia, but couldn't identify the infection source. The other 3 boys recovered slowly over several weeks. The incident brought renewed attention to the mansion. Local newspapers ran stories about the cursed Van Der Berg estate. The property's reputation went from bad to toxic. Any possibility of selling it evaporated. The estate lawyers petitioned the court to allow demolition, arguing the building was dangerous and attracting trespassers. Before the court could rule, something happened that changed everything. The Rockefellers got involved. In early 1903, representatives of the Rockefeller family approached the Van Der Berg estate's trustees with an offer. They would purchase the entire property, all 200 acres, including the mansion and all contents, for a substantial sum. More than the property was worth given its condition and reputation. The offer came with unusual conditions. The sale would be conducted privately, no public records. The Rockefeller name would not appear in any documents. The purchase would be made through a holding company with no obvious connection to the Rockefeller family. The trustees were baffled but relieved. Why the Rockefellers wanted the cursed Van Der Berg mansion wasn't their concern. Getting rid of the property was. They accepted the offer. The sale closed quickly and quietly in March 1903. Understanding why the Rockefellers wanted the property requires understanding events that had occurred mostly in secret. The connection between the Rockefeller family and the Van Der Berg mansion wasn't random. It was personal and deeply troubling to one of America's most powerful families. William Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller's brother and business partner, had a daughter named Catherine. Born in 1880, Catherine was raised with all the advantages wealth provided: education, travel, cultural refinement. She was intelligent, strong-willed, and curious. By her early 20s, Catherine had developed interests her family found concerning. She was drawn to spiritualism and occultism. This wasn't unusual for the period. Spiritualism was fashionable among wealthy women. Séances were social events. Interest in contacting the dead was almost respectable. But Catherine's interest went deeper. She studied seriously. She sought out practitioners and teachers beyond the fashionable mediums entertaining society ladies. She wanted knowledge, not entertainment. In 1902, Catherine learned about Cornelius Van Der Berg and his mansion. The stories about his spiritual experiments, his mysterious death, the supposedly haunted house, all fascinated her. She became somewhat obsessed with learning more. She researched Van Der Berg's life. She tracked down people who'd attended his séances. She obtained copies of some of his writings. Catherine's family was alarmed. The Van Der Berg story involved death, scandal, and extremely negative publicity. Association with it could damage the Rockefeller reputation. William Rockefeller tried to discourage his daughter's interest. This only made Catherine more determined. In late 1902, Catherine announced her intention to visit the mansion herself. The family forbade it absolutely. Catherine was 22 years old, legally an adult, but Rockefeller family pressure was enormous. Catherine's father made clear that if she defied him on this, she would face consequences, restrictions on her trust fund, social isolation within the family. She would be making a serious mistake. Catherine went anyway. In December 1902, Catherine Rockefeller traveled to the Hudson Valley with two companions, women friends who shared her interests. They approached the Van Der Berg mansion legally, having obtained permission from the estate's caretaker. They planned to spend several hours exploring and conducting their own spiritual investigation. What happened during Catherine's visit was reconstructed later from multiple sources, including testimony from her companions and evidence found at the scene. The three women entered the mansion in early afternoon. They explored systematically, examining rooms and taking notes. Catherine was particularly interested in Van Der Berg's séance rooms and his library. She looked for his journals, hoping to find documentation of his methods and results. The women spent several hours in the house without incident. As evening approached, they decided to conduct their own séance in the circular room where Thomas Hendricks had his disturbing experience. Catherine apparently believed the room's unusual acoustics and spatial properties might facilitate spiritual contact. They prepared carefully, following procedures Catherine had learned from her studies. The séance began at dusk. Catherine's companions later reported that initially, nothing unusual occurred. They sat in darkness, attempting to focus and open themselves to spiritual communication. After perhaps 30 minutes, they began hearing sounds. Whispers, similar to what the teenage boys had reported. The sounds grew louder, more distinct, though the words weren't in any language the women recognized. Then Catherine began speaking. Her voice changed, becoming deeper and taking on strange cadences. She spoke in that unknown language the women were hearing. Her eyes were open but appeared unseeing. She stood and moved toward the room's center, walking with odd, jerking movements that her friends said seemed puppet-like. Catherine's companions became frightened. They called her name, tried to break whatever trance she'd entered. Catherine didn't respond. She raised her arms and began a kind of chant. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. One woman later testified she could see her breath. The whispering sounds became a roar that seemed to come from inside the walls. Both companions fled. They ran from the room, down the stairs, out of the mansion. They reached their carriage and told the driver to leave immediately. But they couldn't leave Catherine. Despite their terror, they convinced the driver to wait. They stood outside the mansion, watching the windows of the room where Catherine remained, trying to decide what to do. After about 20 minutes, Catherine emerged. She walked out of the mansion calmly, seemingly unaffected. She appeared confused about why her friends were so upset. She remembered entering the mansion. She remembered exploring. She had no memory of the séance or her behavior during it. The last thing she clearly recalled was suggesting they conduct the séance. Everything after was blank. Catherine's companions brought her back to New York. They debated telling her family what had happened, but Catherine insisted they remain silent. She was shaken by the memory gap, but didn't want to give her father more ammunition to restrict her activities. Her friends reluctantly agreed, though they insisted Catherine promise never to return to the Van Der Berg mansion. Catherine made that promise but didn't keep it. She became obsessed with recovering her missing memories. She believed something significant had happened during the séance, something important she needed to understand. Her lost memories consumed her thoughts. She began experiencing disturbing dreams. She would wake speaking in that unknown language. Her personality began changing in ways her family noticed. William Rockefeller realized something was seriously wrong with his daughter. He pressed her to explain what had happened. Catherine initially resisted, but eventually broke down and told him about visiting the Van Der Berg mansion and the séance that she couldn't remember. William was horrified and furious, but his priority was helping Catherine, and he quickly realized this situation exceeded his understanding. The Rockefeller family quietly consulted experts, doctors, psychologists, even some experts in spiritualism and occultism, though the family was careful about who they contacted and who learned about Catherine's situation. The consensus was disturbing. Catherine was suffering from something the medical professionals couldn't explain. The spiritualist consultant suggested she had opened herself to something dangerous during that séance, something that had partially possessed or influenced her. The proposed solutions ranged from rest and isolation to various spiritual interventions. Some suggested returning to the mansion to attempt a proper closing of whatever doorway Catherine had opened. The Rockefeller family rejected most recommendations as either ineffective or too risky. What they decided on was more direct. They would eliminate the source of the problem. They would acquire the Van Der Berg mansion and everything in it. Then they would destroy it completely, removing any possibility Catherine might return there and ensuring no one else could be affected by whatever malevolent forces inhabited that place. This explained the unusual purchase in March 1903. The Rockefellers, through untraceable intermediaries, bought the property specifically to destroy it, but they faced an unexpected problem. Catherine's condition continued deteriorating. Despite never returning to the mansion, she grew worse. The dreams intensified. The personality changes became more pronounced. She would have episodes where she didn't recognize family members. She spoke in that unknown language for hours. By April 1903, Catherine Rockefeller was essentially imprisoned in her family's estate, kept under constant supervision. Multiple doctors attended her. Nothing helped. The Rockefeller family was desperate and beginning to consider options they would have rejected as absurd months earlier. They consulted more spiritualists, including some with dubious reputations. They were told that Catherine's connection to the mansion was ongoing. Whatever had touched her during that séance maintained its hold. Distance was irrelevant. The only way to break the connection was to cleanse or destroy the location where the initial contact occurred. The Rockefellers decided on destruction. In May 1903, they made plans to demolish the Van Der Berg mansion completely. This created complications. The mansion was a substantial stone structure. Demolition would be expensive, time-consuming, and would attract attention. A building that size couldn't be quietly dismantled. There would be questions about why such a grand estate was being destroyed rather than repurposed. The family didn't care about cost, but they cared intensely about publicity. They needed the demolition to happen without public awareness of the Rockefeller connection or the reasons behind it. This required careful planning and absolute secrecy. They hired a demolition contractor from another state, someone with no Hudson Valley connections. They fabricated a story about structural problems, making the building unsafe and unrepairable. They obtained necessary permits through their shell company. Before demolition began, the Rockefellers wanted everything removed from the mansion. Furniture, artwork, books, all of Van Der Berg's possessions. Some items would be sold or donated far from New York where they couldn't be traced back to Van Der Berg or the Rockefellers. Other items, particularly Van Der Berg's occult materials and journals, would be secured and hidden or destroyed. A team was assembled to catalog and remove the mansion's contents. This work began in June 1903 and immediately encountered problems. Workers reported the same phenomena earlier servants and caretakers had experienced: unexplained sounds, moving shadows, tools disappearing. Several workers quit after a few days. The project manager had to continuously recruit replacements, and he couldn't explain why the job was so difficult to staff without revealing information the Rockefellers wanted secret. The workers removing Van Der Berg's books from the library made disturbing discoveries. Behind some bookcases, they found a hidden room. Van Der Berg had constructed secret spaces within the mansion. The hidden room contained materials Van Der Berg apparently wanted kept especially private. Books in languages most workers couldn't identify. Manuscripts that appeared very old. Ritual objects made from materials workers didn't want to examine closely. And more journals, perhaps 20 volumes, documenting Van Der Berg's experiments in detail. These materials were packed carefully and shipped to a Rockefeller property in New York. William Rockefeller wanted experts to examine them, hoping they might contain information useful for treating Catherine. The experts who reviewed Van Der Berg's secret materials were disturbed by what they found. The journals documented a progression from simple spiritualism to increasingly dark practices. Van Der Berg had been attempting to summon entities he believed were spirits of the dead. By the end, he was trying to command them, to bind them to his service. His final entries suggested he'd succeeded, but that what he'd contacted wasn't spirits of dead humans. He believed he'd opened communication with something else, something that had been waiting for someone to provide a doorway. The experts advised the Rockefellers that Van Der Berg had been dealing with forces beyond his understanding or control, that the mansion might indeed be a kind of doorway that remained open, that Catherine's experience there had connected her to whatever existed on the other side. Breaking that connection would require either Catherine returning to the mansion for a proper cleansing ritual or completely destroying the location to sever the tie. Returning Catherine to the mansion was deemed too dangerous. Even in her deteriorated state, she remained terrified of the place. The family feared what might happen if she went back. Destruction remained the only acceptable option. Demolition began in August 1903. The contractor brought in equipment and workers. The plan was to dismantle the mansion systematically, starting with the roof and working downward. The stone would be broken up and hauled away. The whole process would take several months. By winter, the site would be cleared and the mansion would be gone. The demolition proceeded slowly and with continuous problems. Equipment broke down repeatedly. Workers were injured at an unusually high rate. Strange accidents delayed work. A support beam collapsed while being removed. Though multiple workers testified they saw no reason for the failure. A fire broke out in the workers' equipment shed, destroying tools and supplies. Several workers reported seeing figures in the mansion at night, though the building was supposedly unoccupied. Most disturbing were reports from workers about the ballroom. When they began dismantling that space, removing the dome and the strange statues, several workers reported overwhelming feelings of dread and nausea. 2 workers were found unconscious in the ballroom. They recovered but couldn't explain what happened. They'd been working normally, then both collapsed simultaneously. The foreman decided to avoid the ballroom temporarily and work on other areas first. Meanwhile, Catherine's condition reached a crisis point. In September 1903, she suffered what doctors called a complete mental collapse. She became violent, attacking staff and family members. She spoke only in that unknown language. Her eyes, family members reported, looked different, as though she was looking at things no one else could see. She was physically restrained for her own safety and the safety of others. The Rockefeller family was frantic. William Rockefeller demanded the demolition be accelerated regardless of cost or difficulty. He wanted that mansion erased immediately. The contractor tried, but the problems intensified. As demolition reached the séance rooms in the eastern wing, the location where Catherine had her experience, workers began refusing to enter that section. Some quit outright. Others simply avoided that wing, working on different areas even when ordered to proceed with the séance rooms. The contractor was in an impossible situation. His workers were terrified. The job was months behind schedule. Equipment costs were exceeding estimates. But the contract included substantial penalties for delays, and the client was a Rockefeller. He had to finish. He brought in new workers, offering premium wages. He personally supervised the séance room demolition. On October 15, 1903, workers finally began dismantling the circular room where Catherine had conducted her séance. They removed the door. They began tearing out the interior plaster. As they worked, sounds began emanating from the room. All workers heard them, a roaring noise that seemed to come from inside the walls. Then screaming, though no one present was screaming. The temperature dropped suddenly and dramatically. The workers fled. The contractor tried to order them back, but they refused. He went into the room himself to assess the situation. He was found minutes later, unconscious on the floor. When revived, he reported seeing something in the room. He couldn't describe it clearly, saying only that it was wrong, that it shouldn't exist, that looking at it caused physical pain. The contractor quit. He abandoned the project despite the financial consequences. Finding a replacement contractor who would take the job proved nearly impossible. Word had spread among construction and demolition companies. The Van Der Berg mansion was cursed. Whatever premium the client would pay wasn't worth the risk. While the Rockefellers struggled to find someone to complete the demolition, Catherine died. On November 3, 1903, Catherine Rockefeller was found dead in her room at the family estate. She was 23 years old. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure. The real cause was something doctors couldn't identify and the family would never discuss publicly. Catherine's death devastated her family and changed the situation with the mansion. The original purpose of the demolition, breaking Catherine's connection to that place, was moot. But now the family had additional motivation. The mansion had killed Catherine as surely as if someone had put a knife in her. The Rockefellers wanted it destroyed out of grief and rage. William Rockefeller personally took control of the demolition project. He hired a new contractor with explicit instructions. Burn it. Don't dismantle it stone by stone. Set the whole structure on fire and let it burn completely. Then clear whatever remains. Rockefeller didn't care about appearance or subtlety anymore. He wanted that building gone. In December 1903, the Van Der Berg mansion burned. The fire was officially ruled accidental. A worker's carelessly discarded cigarette igniting construction materials. The truth was arson, deliberate and complete. The mansion burned for hours. The fire was visible for miles. The stone walls, which had survived Van Der Berg's death and years of neglect and partial demolition, survived the fire. But everything combustible was consumed. The interior was gutted completely. The roof collapsed. The floors fell through. What remained was a burned shell. Even that wasn't enough for the Rockefellers. Over the following months, crews worked to demolish what remained. The standing walls were pulled down. The stone was broken up. The entire foundation was excavated and removed. Every piece of the mansion was hauled away. Some stone went to quarries where it was crushed for road base. Some was dumped in remote locations. The goal was to scatter the mansion's physical remains so completely that nothing cohesive remained. The site itself was excavated deeply, removing not just the foundation but soil to a depth of several feet. The Rockefellers wanted no trace left. The excavated area was filled with clean soil brought from elsewhere. The entire 200-acre property was left undeveloped. The Rockefeller holding company that owned it maintained the land but built nothing. The forest was allowed to reclaim the site. Within a few years, no visible evidence remained that a mansion had ever stood there. But the Rockefellers weren't finished. Destroying the physical structure was only part of their plan. They needed to erase the mansion from history, from public memory, from any record that might lead others to become curious about what had happened there. This effort was methodical, extensive, and remarkably successful. The first step involved acquiring and destroying documentation. The Rockefellers purchased Van Der Berg's personal papers from his estate. Every journal, every letter, every document related to his spiritualist activities was secured. Most were burned. Some were locked away in Rockefeller family vaults, hidden so deeply that even most family members didn't know they existed. The journals documenting Van Der Berg's final experiments, the materials found in his hidden room, all disappeared into Rockefeller control. Architectural plans for the mansion were tracked down and acquired. Edmund Whitmore, the architect who designed the building, had died in 1901. His firm's records were purchased by a Rockefeller shell company and selectively edited. Plans for the Van Der Berg mansion were removed. The project disappeared from Whitmore's portfolio as though it had never existed. References to it in architectural publications were identified. In some cases, the Rockefellers purchased entire print runs of journals or books that mentioned the mansion. Those publications became mysteriously rare, vanishing from libraries and private collections. Photographs of the mansion were systematically acquired. The Rockefellers hired agents to locate and purchase any photographic images of the property. Some were bought from former servants or visitors who'd taken pictures. Others were found in newspaper archives, particularly articles about Van Der Berg's death or the later incidents. The Rockefellers bought the photographs and the negatives when possible. When negatives couldn't be obtained, they bought the prints and any plates that might produce more copies. The visual record of the mansion was nearly eliminated. The Rockefellers also worked to suppress the stories. Newspapers that had covered Van Der Berg's death or the mansion's reputation were approached. In some cases, publishers were offered donations or investments in exchange for cooperation. Archived articles about the mansion became difficult to find. Some newspaper morgues experienced convenient fires or floods that destroyed specific file sections. Other times, individual articles were simply removed from bound volumes, leaving gaps in the historical record that archivists attributed to normal deterioration or past misfiling. People who'd known Van Der Berg or worked at the mansion were more difficult to manage. The Rockefellers couldn't make living people disappear, but they could encourage silence. Former servants and workers were located and offered money. Not bribes exactly, but generous payments described as compensation for their distress. The payments came with non-disclosure agreements. Recipients agreed not to discuss their experiences at the mansion publicly. Most accepted. The money was substantial, and talking about the cursed mansion offered no benefits. Some people refused to be silenced. A few former servants and one of the mediums who'd attended Van Der Berg's séances tried to tell their stories publicly. They found obstacles. Publishers weren't interested in their accounts. Newspapers declined to run their stories. When they persisted, more direct pressure was applied. Anonymous threats suggested they should reconsider. Economic pressure was brought against some. A former servant who insisted on discussing his experiences found himself unable to find employment. Potential employers received warnings about his unreliability and instability. Eventually, he stopped trying to tell his story. The effort to erase the mansion extended to official records. Property records, tax assessments, permits, all the governmental documentation of the mansion's existence was targeted. The Rockefellers had influence with state and local authorities. Records were transferred to their custody for supposed review or legal purposes and never returned. File clerks were paid to misfile or lose documents. The paper trail documenting the property's history became fragmentary and confusing. The Van Der Berg family name presented another challenge. Cornelius had been wealthy and socially prominent. His death had been noted in New York society, but he had no direct descendants, and his siblings wanted distance from his legacy. The Rockefellers cultivated relationships with surviving Van Der Berg family members. They offered assistance and support. In exchange, the family cooperated in minimizing Cornelius's profile. His obituaries were forgotten. His business accomplishments went unrecorded in corporate histories. His name faded from society registers and genealogical records. The Van Der Berg family essentially allowed Cornelius to be erased, grateful to escape association with his scandalous end. Local residents near the mansion's former site were a persistent problem. They remembered the property. They'd seen the mansion. They knew about the deaths and the strange occurrences. But memories fade, and people are reluctant to discuss things that make them seem irrational. The Rockefellers didn't try to make locals forget. They simply ensured that when locals did mention the old Van Der Berg place, their stories sounded like folklore rather than history. Without documentation, photographs, or corroboration, the accounts became ghost stories. People dismissed them as exaggerated legends, tales that had grown in the telling. This process took years. Through the 1900s and 1910s, the Rockefellers steadily eliminated evidence of the mansion's existence. By 1920, the Van Der Berg mansion had largely disappeared from accessible historical records. Researchers interested in Hudson Valley estates wouldn't find it. Architectural historians studying Gilded Age construction wouldn't encounter it. The building had been substantial, expensive, and architecturally notable, yet it left almost no historical trace. The Rockefellers maintained ownership of the property through various holding companies and trusts. The land was never developed or sold. It sat as forest, unremarkable acreage along the Hudson that appeared on maps but attracted no attention. The holding companies that owned it were structured to obscure beneficial ownership. Tracing them back to the Rockefeller family required navigating multiple corporate layers designed to prevent exactly that discovery. The effort to erase the mansion succeeded so completely that by the 1930s, most people had forgotten it ever existed. The name Van Der Berg meant nothing to new generations. The stories about the cursed mansion were told by elderly locals who remembered, but were dismissed as tall tales. Historians researching the Gilded Age didn't know to look for it. The mansion had been removed from history nearly as thoroughly as it had been removed from its physical site. But complete erasure is impossible. Information persists in unexpected places. Fragments survive even the most thorough purge, and some secrets are too significant to remain buried forever, regardless of how much money and power work to keep them hidden. The story of the Van Der Berg mansion began resurfacing decades later through disconnected fragments that researchers slowly assembled into a coherent narrative. The rediscovery started with architectural research conducted in the 1960s. A graduate student studying Edmund Whitmore's work found references in Whitmore's personal correspondence to a major project in the Hudson Valley in the mid-1890s. The letters mentioned the commission but not the client's name or the location. The project didn't appear in Whitmore's official portfolio. The student noted the discrepancy but couldn't explain it. Around the same time, a local historian in the Hudson Valley collected oral histories from elderly residents. Several mentioned an old mansion that had stood somewhere in the area decades earlier. The stories were vague about location and confused about details, but multiple independent sources mentioned the same basic elements. Large stone house. Wealthy owner who died mysteriously. Reputation as haunted. The house was torn down or burned. The stories disagreed about which. The historian documented these accounts but treated them as folklore rather than historical fact. These separate threads remained disconnected until the 1970s when a researcher investigating Rockefeller family history stumbled across references to a property purchase in 1903. The purchase was unusual, conducted through intermediaries, and carefully hidden in trust documents. The researcher was investigating Rockefeller business practices, not looking for anything related to a mansion, but the unusual nature of the transaction caught attention. Why would the Rockefellers go to such lengths to hide a simple real estate purchase? Tracing the property revealed it was Hudson Valley land that the Rockefeller-controlled entities still owned. The researcher visited the site and found nothing but forest. No structures, no ruins, no evidence of previous development. But the property's history became a puzzle worth investigating. Connecting it to the Van Der Berg mansion took years more research across multiple archival sources. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. In the 1980s, a collector of rare books acquired a volume that had belonged to Cornelius Van Der Berg. Inside the cover was a bookplate with Van Der Berg's name and an engraving showing a large mansion. The collector researched Van Der Berg out of curiosity and found almost nothing. A wealthy man who died in 1900. That was all readily available records showed, but the bookplate suggested Van Der Berg had owned a significant estate. The collector's inquiries connected with the earlier research fragments, the architectural student's work on Whitmore, the local historian's oral histories, the researcher's discovery of the hidden Rockefeller property purchase. These separate pieces suddenly formed a pattern. The various researchers began collaborating informally, sharing information and pursuing leads. They discovered that while the Rockefellers had eliminated most documentation, they'd missed fragments. A photograph of the mansion survived in a private family album belonging to a descendant of one of the construction workers. The photos showed the mansion's exterior, proving it had been substantial and architecturally impressive. A letter from a former servant describing the strange occurrences surfaced in a collection donated to a university library. A newspaper article about Van Der Berg's death, missing from most archives, existed in a private collection of historical news clippings. Each discovery was small, but together they allowed researchers to reconstruct the mansion's basic history. Van Der Berg's obsession with spiritualism, the mansion's unusual design, the mysterious death, the subsequent incidents, the Rockefeller purchase and demolition. The pieces fit together into a narrative that explained the gaps in the historical record. But the most significant discovery came in 1991. A researcher investigating Catherine Rockefeller's life, unaware of the mansion connection, found references in private family papers to Catherine's mental illness and death. The papers had been archived decades earlier with restricted access. As the restriction period expired, they became available to researchers. Among these papers were some of Catherine's letters and diary entries from 1902 and 1903. Catherine's writings revealed her fascination with Van Der Berg's work. She documented her visit to the mansion. She described the séance and its aftermath in terms that made clear something traumatic had occurred. Later entries showed her deteriorating mental state and her terror of what she believed was pursuing her. The writings were fragmentary, but they established the connection between Catherine Rockefeller and the Van Der Berg mansion definitively. This discovery explained the Rockefeller involvement. They hadn't purchased the property for investment or development. They'd bought it to destroy it because of what happened to Catherine. The extraordinary effort to erase the mansion from history made sense in light of the family's grief and desire to prevent others from suffering Catherine's fate. The researchers compiled their findings and attempted to publish. This proved difficult. Academic journals questioned the story's credibility. The fragmentary evidence, the missing documentation, the seemingly fantastic elements all raised doubts. Some reviewers suggested the researchers had constructed a conspiracy theory from disconnected facts. Publishers hesitated to release books about the mansion without more substantial proof. The few publications that did appear attracted limited attention. The story was too strange and too poorly documented to gain mainstream historical acceptance. The researchers were frustrated but continued investigating. They believed they'd uncovered something significant, a genuine mystery that the Rockefeller family had successfully suppressed for decades. But proving it to broader historical and public acceptance remained difficult. Then in 2003, exactly 100 years after the Rockefeller purchase, something unexpected happened. A trunk belonging to William Rockefeller was discovered in a storage facility being cleared out during a state reorganization. The trunk had been sealed and apparently forgotten. Inside were documents William had kept separately from other family papers. Among these documents were some of Van Der Berg's journals, materials William had reviewed while trying to understand what had happened to Catherine. The journals were genuine. Handwriting analysis confirmed they were written by Van Der Berg. The content was disturbing and detailed. Van Der Berg described his spiritual experiments with precision. He documented the progression from simple séances to more dangerous practices. His final entries, written days before his death, showed a man who realized he'd made terrible mistakes but didn't know how to correct them. The discovery of Van Der Berg's journals provided the evidence researchers needed. Here was primary documentation in Van Der Berg's own hand. The journals verified the basic story and provided details no researcher could have invented. Academic skepticism faded. The Van Der Berg mansion story moved from dubious legend to accepted historical fact. With the journal's publication, public interest increased dramatically. News articles covered the story of the cursed mansion the Rockefellers erased from history. Documentary filmmakers explored the subject. The property's location, while not officially confirmed, was identified through careful analysis of the historical fragments. Curious people began visiting the area, hoping to find the site. The Rockefeller family, still controlling the property through various trusts, declined all comment. They neither confirmed nor denied the story. They maintained privacy around the property, keeping it closed to the public. No signs marked the location. No acknowledgement of the site's history was ever made. The family's silence spoke volumes. If the story was false, why not simply deny it? The refusal to address the subject suggested the truth hit too close to family pain. Researchers who'd spent years piecing together the mansion's history felt vindicated, but also deeply unsettled. As they studied Van Der Berg's journals more carefully, they found his descriptions of what he believed he'd contacted disturbing even a century later. Van Der Berg wrote about entities that existed outside normal physical reality. Beings that were aware and intelligent, but not human and not friendly to humanity. He described a metaphysical architecture to reality that included layers or dimensions beyond human perception. He believed his mansion, through its design and through the rituals conducted within it, had created a weak point between dimensions. A doorway that once opened was difficult to close. Van Der Berg's final journal entries suggested he understood too late that he'd created something dangerous. The mansion itself had become a focal point for entities trying to enter human reality. His death was presented in the journal not as a heart attack or random event, but as the consequence of direct contact with something that human nervous systems weren't equipped to perceive or comprehend. Catherine's later experience was the same thing happening to someone else who'd approached that doorway unprepared. The researchers debated whether Van Der Berg's metaphysical claims should be taken seriously. Some argued it was the delusional thinking of a man descending into madness. Others pointed out that Van Der Berg had been lucid and methodical in his writing. He documented his experiments carefully. He described phenomena that matched what others had reported experiencing at the mansion. Dismissing his claims entirely required dismissing too much corroborating evidence. The question remained unresolved. Had Van Der Berg actually opened some kind of doorway to another reality, or had he simply created an environment where people experienced psychological phenomena they interpreted through a spiritualist framework? The difference mattered philosophically, but might not matter practically. Whether the danger was metaphysical or psychological, the mansion had clearly been harmful to people who spent time there. Van Der Berg died. Catherine died. Others were affected, some severely. The mansion's destructive impact was real regardless of the mechanism. Modern visitors to the approximate location report varied experiences. The property remains off-limits, but the surrounding forest is accessible. Some people report feeling uncomfortable in the area. Others notice nothing unusual. The reports are inconsistent and subjective, impossible to verify. Skeptics attribute them to suggestion and expectation. People who know the story naturally feel uneasy in a place with such dark history. Believers interpret the reports as evidence that something genuinely wrong persists at the site. No one has seriously proposed rebuilding anything at the location. The Rockefeller Trust control the property and show no interest in developing it. Local authorities have no plans for the land. It sits as unused forest, privately held and maintained, but essentially abandoned. The area is monitored by security that keeps trespassers away, though the security presence is subtle enough that casual hikers might not notice it. The Rockefeller family apparently intends to maintain indefinite control, ensuring the site remains undeveloped and inaccessible. The question of whether anything remains at the site beyond unmarked forest has intrigued researchers. The demolition was thorough, but was it complete? The Rockefellers excavated deeply, but did they remove everything? Some investigators have used historical surveys and old property maps to identify where the mansion's foundation would have been located. Ground-penetrating radar has been discussed as a way to see if any subsurface structures or anomalies remain. But accessing the property to conduct such investigations requires Rockefeller cooperation, which hasn't been granted. A few researchers have speculated about what might remain hidden. Van Der Berg's journals mentioned he'd constructed hidden rooms and concealed some materials within the mansion's structure. The workers removing contents before demolition found one hidden room. Were there others? When the mansion burned and was demolished, were those hidden spaces discovered? Or might materials Van Der Berg concealed still exist, buried under soil and forest growth? The possibility that Van Der Berg's most dangerous materials might remain hidden at the site troubles some researchers. His journals referenced texts and objects he considered powerful but hazardous. If those items weren't found and destroyed, they might still exist somewhere underground at the site. Given the Rockefeller security presence, they're clearly concerned about something. Whether that's archaeological artifacts, buried foundation remains, or something else is unclear. The Van Der Berg mansion story raises broader questions about what gets remembered and what gets forgotten in American history. How many other significant buildings or events have been deliberately erased from historical record? The Rockefellers succeeded almost completely in removing the mansion from history for nearly a century. They had the resources, motivation, and methods to do it. If this erasure was possible, what else might have been erased by powerful families protecting their interests or hiding embarrassing truths? The story also illustrates the limits of historical documentation. Historians work with available sources, but those sources can be manipulated, destroyed, or hidden. The documentary record reflects not just what happened, but what was documented and what documentation survived. When powerful entities work to eliminate evidence, even significant events can vanish from history. The Van Der Berg mansion was a major architectural achievement, the site of documented deaths and strange phenomena, and connected to one of America's most prominent families. Yet it disappeared from accessible history for decades. What else disappeared more completely, leaving no traces for researchers to eventually reassemble? For the Rockefeller family, the mansion represents a wound that apparently never healed. Catherine's death in 1903 was presented publicly as natural causes, and the family grieved privately. But the circumstance of her death, the connection to Van Der Berg's experiments, and the family's extreme response in erasing the mansion from existence all suggest a trauma beyond ordinary grief. The family spent enormous resources to destroy the mansion and hide what happened. That effort continued for decades, well beyond the point where anyone directly involved had died. The persistence of the cover-up suggests it wasn't just about protecting Catherine's memory or the family reputation. It suggests ongoing fear. The Rockefeller family, even generations removed from the events of 1903, apparently believes something genuinely dangerous is associated with that property. Whether the danger is supernatural, psychological, or simply reputational, they've maintained control over the site and silence about its history for over a century. That consistency across multiple generations implies more than casual concern. Some researchers who've studied the mansion's history report developing their own unease about the subject. Spending months or years researching Van Der Berg's experiments, reading his journals, examining accounts of what happened to people at the mansion seems to affect people. Some describe disturbing dreams. Others report sensing that they're investigating something that perhaps should remain buried. A few have abandoned their research entirely, unwilling to continue engaging with the material. These reports are anecdotal and subjective, but they're consistent enough to notice. The question of whether the mansion was genuinely cursed or whether the label reflects psychological and social phenomena remains unresolved. Skeptical explanations are available for every element of the story. Van Der Berg was mentally unstable. His death was natural but occurred in theatrical circumstances that spawned exaggerated stories. Catherine suffered from mental illness. Her family blamed the mansion incident rather than accepting her condition had internal causes. The various phenomena reported at the mansion resulted from suggestion, fear, and the power of belief to create subjective experiences. These skeptical explanations are plausible and satisfy many investigators, but they require dismissing or explaining away substantial amounts of testimony from multiple sources across many years. They require assuming mass delusion or coordinated fabrication. They require believing the Rockefellers responded so extremely to protect against a merely imagined threat. The skeptical case is possible, but requires its own leaps. The alternative, that Van Der Berg somehow created or discovered something genuinely dangerous, requires accepting ideas outside mainstream understanding of reality. It requires considering that consciousness, spiritual forces, or entities beyond human comprehension might exist. It requires taking seriously the possibility that certain practices or locations can become genuinely harmful in ways science doesn't yet explain. This alternative is harder to accept for many people, but arguably fits the evidence more completely. The Van Der Berg mansion stands, or fails to stand, as a monument to questions without clear answers. A wealthy man's obsession created something remarkable and possibly terrible. A young woman's curiosity led to tragedy. A powerful family's resources nearly erased the entire story from history. What remains is fragmentary evidence and persistent mystery. The physical structure is gone, destroyed so thoroughly that its exact location is uncertain. The documentation is scattered and incomplete. The people who experienced the events directly are long dead. Yet the story persists and continues attracting attention. Something about the mansion resonates despite or because of its incomplete documentation. Perhaps it's the Gothic elements, the mansion designed for spiritual experiments, the mysterious deaths, the powerful family's cover-up. These components create a narrative that feels both historical and mythic. Or perhaps the story persists because, underneath the dramatic details, it addresses genuine questions about consciousness, reality, and whether human investigation into certain areas leads to danger. The site itself remains inaccessible and unmarked. Forest covers what was once manicured grounds. Trees grow where the mansion stood. Nature has reclaimed the space completely, aided by the Rockefellers' thorough elimination of any built environment. A visitor to the area would see nothing suggesting that one of the Hudson Valley's grandest estates once occupied that location. The erasure is nearly complete. Nearly, but not entirely. The story survived despite everything. Van Der Berg's obsession, Catherine's tragedy, the Rockefellers' attempt to erase it all, the researchers who pieced together fragments and refused to let the story disappear completely. The mansion is gone, but the memory remains, recovered from deliberate forgetting and preserved despite powerful opposition. What that preservation means is open to interpretation. Perhaps it's simply an interesting historical footnote, a story of Gilded Age excess and family tragedy. Perhaps it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsession and the consequences of investigating realms beyond human understanding. Perhaps it's evidence that some truths refuse to stay buried regardless of how thoroughly they're covered. The forest continues growing over the site. The Rockefeller Trust continue maintaining control. Security continues preventing access. The surviving documentation sits in archives, available to researchers but scattered across multiple institutions. Van Der Berg's journals, or the portions that survive, provide detailed documentation of his experiments and his final realization that he'd made catastrophic mistakes. Catherine's letters and diary fragments record her fascination, her experience, and her descent into the condition that killed her. These primary sources exist. They're real documents that can be examined, analyzed, and debated. They're not legend or folklore, but historical evidence. What that evidence proves remains contentious, but its existence is not. Something happened at the Van Der Berg mansion. People died. The Rockefellers responded with extraordinary measures to destroy and hide it. These are facts, documented and verifiable. The meaning and significance of those facts continue to be debated. Skeptics and believers both study the same materials and reach different conclusions. Academic historians, paranormal investigators, architectural researchers, and curious amateurs all examine the Van Der Berg mansion story from different perspectives and with different assumptions. The conversation continues, and likely will continue as long as people are drawn to mysteries that resist complete explanation. The cursed mansion the Rockefellers tried to erase from history remains erased physically but recovered historically. The building is gone, destroyed as completely as money and determination could accomplish. But the story survived, reassembled from fragments and now documented more thoroughly than the Rockefellers intended. The family succeeded in their immediate goal of destroying the mansion. They failed in their ultimate goal of erasing what happened from human memory and historical record. That failure might be fortunate. If the mansion story contains genuine warnings, either about psychological dangers of obsession with the occult or about metaphysical hazards of investigating certain areas, then preserving the account serves a purpose beyond historical interest. If Van Der Berg and Catherine Rockefeller died because they approached something dangerous, their stories become cautionary examples. If the mansion was genuinely harmful, documenting what made it dangerous could prevent others from repeating those mistakes. Or perhaps the story's value is simply historical. A chapter in American history that was nearly lost, now preserved. A glimpse into how the wealthy lived and died in the Gilded Age. An example of how powerful families can shape historical memory, but not control it absolutely. A case study in historical erasure and recovery. These contributions justify preserving the Van Der Berg mansion story regardless of debates about its supernatural elements. The mansion itself, or the absence where it stood, remains in that unmarked Hudson Valley forest. The location can be approximated from historical sources, but not definitively confirmed without access to the actual site. The Rockefeller-controlled trusts that own the property maintain their silence and their security. Whether anything remains buried beneath the forest floor is unknown. Whether the site retains any properties that made the mansion dangerous is impossible to verify without investigation the property owners prevent. This final inaccessibility feels appropriate somehow. The mansion was built to be a bridge between accessible reality and whatever lies beyond. Its destruction was meant to close that bridge and seal away whatever dangers it presented. That the site remains closed, controlled, and hidden preserves that separation. If the mansion was genuinely hazardous, keeping the location restricted serves public safety. If the Rockefellers simply want to maintain privacy around family tragedy, that's understandable given the circumstances. Either way, the physical site remains off limits while the story has become accessible. The reversal is complete. The Rockefellers eliminated the building, but the account of what happened there survived and spread. You cannot visit the mansion, but you can read about it, study the documents, examine the evidence, and draw your own conclusions about what Van Der Berg created and what happened to those who entered his strange architectural vision. The Van Der Berg mansion, the cursed estate the Rockefellers tried to erase, exists now primarily as documented memory and persistent questions. The stone walls were pulled down. The foundation was excavated. The site was cleared and allowed to return to forest. But the story survived, recovered piece by piece from the fragments that escape even the most thorough erasure. In that recovery, in the persistence of memory against powerful opposition, the mansion achieves a strange immortality, not as a physical structure but as a documented mystery that continues fascinating people over a century after the building's destruction. The forest grows. The Rockefellers maintain their watch. Researchers continue investigating, and the story of Cornelius Van Der Berg's mansion, his obsession that built it, Catherine Rockefeller's tragedy that led to its destruction, and the extraordinary effort to erase it all from history remains preserved in archives and now in accounts like this. The curse, if it existed, may have died with the mansion. Or perhaps it persists in different form, in the compulsion people feel to investigate despite warnings, to approach mysteries despite dangers, to seek truth despite powers that work to hide it. The mansion is gone, but its story endures, and will likely endure as long as people are drawn to the intersection of wealth, obsession, death, and questions that resist easy answers.